For centuries, the West looted African gold, rewrote history, assassinated heroes, and called it civilization. Then they gave elections with no power, aid with no dignity, and media with no truth. And just when they thought Africa was tamed forever, Traore stood up, not as a puppet, not as a polished diplomat, but as a storm. And now the same Western media that applauded war criminals and glorified colonizers is calling him the problem. But why are so many efforts being made to defame him?
Traore seems to be online everywhere all the time. In much of the material, he's lionized as the young king of Africa.
Is this the same playbook they used against Gaddafi, playing out all over again? Let's find out. These are the accusations, the smears, the carefully crafted warnings whispered through Western media headlines. They say it's a cult. They say it's chaos. They say Traore is nothing but a digital illusion. But today, we answer. Every word, every lie, every fear they tried to pass off as fact, not with apologies, not with explanations, with the truth, the kind they hoped no one would ever say out loud. Let's begin. You want to know what keeps the West up at night? It's not Traore's AI photos, not TikToks or slogans. It's the horrifying realization that Africa no longer needs Western permission to tell its own story. For decades, the Western media monopolized the African narrative. They decided who was a hero and who was a thug, who deserved headlines and who deserved silence. Nelson Mandela, hero, but only after they imprisoned him for 27 years. Patrice Lumumba, vanished in a shallow grave with barely a whisper. Thomas Sankara, too radical to live, too dangerous to honor. And now, suddenly, a new leader rises, one they didn't groom, didn't select, didn't understand, and he's trending across the continent like wildfire. Ibrahim Traore's face isn't just going viral, it's going global. Posters in Jamaica, chants in Accra, TikToks from Lagos to Paris. This isn't a marketing campaign, it's a movement, it's symbolism on fire, and that's the real threat. Because in the colonial handbook, Africa was only allowed to react, never to create. Africans were meant to consume media, not produce mythology. We were allowed to be the subject of white photographers, the poor victims in dusty UN reports, but never the architects of our legends. That's why they're calling it a cult. That's why they're mocking the AI-generated images of Traore draped in the Pan-African flag, standing with glowing eyes, or leading imaginary armies into the heart of Western strongholds. They're not worried about facts. They're worried about faith. Because what they see rising online is not just admiration, it's a belief. The kind that built revolutions. The kind that cannot be audited, fact-checked, or silenced. And let's talk honestly about these AI accusations. Western media complains about manipulated images and deepfake anthems. These are the same media ecosystems that ran entire campaigns on fabricated weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that used heavily edited footage to justify NATO bombing Libya into dust. They published endless expert analysis from think tanks funded by oil companies and weapons manufacturers, and then dared to call it truth. But now, when an African teenager uses Midjourney to show Traore standing in Times Square with a glowing Sankara beside him, that's where they draw the line? That's suddenly the collapse of reality? Number. What they mean is, they lost the monopoly. They can't shape the African image anymore. They can't dictate which faces go on money, which voices go on the radio, which dreams are allowed to circulate. And in that loss, they see the beginning of something they cannot stop. Africa becoming the author, not the anecdote. Even worse for them, the youth aren't asking for permission. They're remixing history with digital fire. They're saying, if Sankara's death was erased from your textbooks, we'll resurrect him on our screens. They're not just resharing Traore videos, they're rewriting reality, replacing shame with power, scars with armor, and silence with drums. And to the Western analysts crying about digital hallucinations, what do you think colonial history books were? What do you think Hollywood portrayals of Africa were? Lies with better lighting. So now, when we create our version of epic, suddenly it's dangerous? Let's say this clearly. Traore's digital image may be stylized, but the pain it represents is real. The dreams it ignites are real. The joy it brings to those who've only known betrayal is real. What scares the West is not that Traore is being mythologized. It's that Africans are no longer waiting for statues. They're building their gods in pixels. And guess what? You can ban a protest. You can censor a speech. But you can't stop a generation that has turned its struggle into a story, then hit share. That's what's happening. And that's why they're scared. If the Western media meltdown over Traore was just about deepfakes or AI images, they'd laugh it off. But they're not laughing. They're panicking. Why? Because this is no longer about images on screens. It's about ideas and minds. And the idea is simple, but deadly to the old order. That Africans don't need the West to define freedom. The article claims Traore's popularity is all rhetoric, with little institutional reform. They toss in fancy words like populism, emotion, and algorithmic spectacle. But let's unmask what that means. He didn't follow the Western script. And that, in their eyes, is the greatest sin. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. For decades, African leaders were trained to say the right things to Paris and Washington. They wore suits, they kissed the rings, they held elections that changed nothing, and built economies where everything was owned by someone else. That's what the West called freedom, a theater of democracy where the actors are poor, the audience is rich, and the script is always in English or French. Traore walked onto that stage and ripped the script in half. No, he didn't give Western investors tax breaks. No, he didn't call Macron for instructions. No, he didn't bow to the IMF with spreadsheets in hand. Instead, he taxed telecom giants. He kicked out French troops. He refused to let foreign embassies run the show. He slashed minister salaries and increased pay for civil servants. He told the West, "You don't run Burkina Faso anymore." And now the same people who backed tyrants for decades, who armed rebels, bribed governments, and extracted gold while children starved, dare to say he's not delivering reforms fast enough? Where was this concern when France bled Africa's resources dry through France-Afrique? Where were the op-eds when corrupt presidents built castles and Swiss accounts with IMF money while hospitals collapsed? But suddenly, because Traore isn't implementing Western-designed good governance templates, they say he's all talk? Let's make one thing clear. The West doesn't care about freedom. They care about order, their order, and Traore broke it. The article warns that Traore's supporters are drowning out dissenting voices. But ask yourself this. What happens when the only dissent allowed is the kind funded by foreign NGOs? What happens when local journalists are trained by institutions with subtle strings attached? What happens when civil society is just a nicer name for soft regime change? You think people can't see that now? Burkinabe youth are not silencing dissent. They're finally louder than it. And that is what Western media can't forgive. Because Traore didn't rise by pleasing donors. He rose by saying something simple that no expert dared to say: Africa is not free. Not truly, not yet. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said the truth like a bullet. And when the truth isn't softened with diplomatic small talk, it becomes threatening. Now they say he's dangerous, unpredictable. They say this isn't reform, it's rebellion. Exactly. Because real reform doesn't look like what the West built in post-colonial Africa. It doesn't look like fake parliaments, debt traps labeled assistance, or NGOs that police freedom like a private army. Real reform means turning the whole structure upside down. It means not just changing the players, but changing the game. Traore is doing that. And they're screaming not because he's failed, but because he hasn't asked for help. He didn't call the World Bank. He didn't host a democracy summit. He didn't even flinch when they pulled the aid. Because his legitimacy doesn't come from Western observers. It comes from the people in the streets. That is why he's feared, not just watched. Because once an African leader proves that sovereignty can be real, not just ceremonial, others might try it too. And if Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea follow the same path, then what? Then the entire house of cards, this illusion that Africa can only function under Western supervision, collapses. So no, Traore's message is not empty. It's not just vibes. It's proof that you can lead without kneeling. And if that truth spreads, their whole system dies. This isn't about one man. It's about a model, one that speaks of dignity, not dependency. And that's the one model the West never wanted Africans to believe in. Now let's talk about why they are doing all this. You know what happens when an African leader refuses to beg, doesn't compromise, and won't submit to Western instruction? They don't debate him, they define him. And so the smear campaign begins, carefully scripted, strategically timed, and always disguised as concern. They no longer assassinate your body, they assassinate your character, slowly, relentlessly, until people forget what you stood for and only remember the headline. Just read the article again. It doesn't attack Traore's policies. It attacks the aura around him, the imagery, the excitement. As if believing in your leader is a criminal act, as if unity is suspicious, as if popular support must be a delusion. Why? Because the West has always feared charismatic African leadership. They were never threatened by bureaucrats. They were threatened by symbols. Patrice Lumumba wasn't feared because of a speech. He was feared because the people listened. Thomas Sankara wasn't taken out for riding a bike. He was taken out because he made dignity contagious. Traore is stepping into that legacy, and the reaction has been swift. He's being called messianic, glorified, and mythologized. Not by his people, but by foreign journalists, watching from a distance, writing with panic in their pens. To them, any African leader who is loved, truly loved, must be faking it. Because in their minds, only Western-trained technocrats are legitimate. If you don't quote Harvard studies and wear a blue tie, your popularity must be a glitch in the algorithm. That's why the article focuses on AI and TikTok. Because it's easier to blame technology than to admit the West has lost the emotional loyalty of African youth. And now they're scrambling to explain it away. It's AI, they say. It's deepfakes, they warn. It's mass delusion, they sigh. It's real hearts, real anger, real dreams, flooding the internet faster than your think pieces can keep up. They even dragged Rihanna and Beyoncé into it, claiming deepfake songs were circulating online praising Traore. Do they believe young Africans need pop stars to validate their leaders? That's how shallow their understanding is. That's how much they underestimate the pride building on this continent. Let's be clear, no one needs Beyoncé to approve of Traore. But it does amuse the youth to remix the West's biggest stars into songs for Africa's rising revolution. It's a mockery. It's reverse propaganda. It's poetic justice. Because for once, the symbols aren't working in the West's favor. And so, as always, they default to their oldest weapon, doubt. They say he hasn't done enough, that his country is still unstable, that many regions remain under threat, that his rhetoric hasn't matched tangible governance. Let's pause here. Do you know what they never mention? Burkina Faso was already collapsing when Traore took over. 2 million people were displaced before he stepped in. Insurgents controlled vast territories under Western-trained armies, that the country was a puppet state wrapped in French flags and suffocating debt. But Traore isn't given the dignity of context. He's expected to fix in 2 years what 60 years of exploitation built. And when he doesn't produce instant utopia, they declare him a failure. While giving endless benefit of the doubt to corrupt regimes, they prop up from Kenya to Ukraine. They even go further, accusing him of fostering an atmosphere where journalists feel unsafe, where dissent is silenced, where critique is attacked by online mobs. But isn't that ironic? Because no one silences opposition like the West. Where was this concern for press freedom when Gaddafi was lynched live on Western screens? Where was it when Sankara's speeches were erased from archives? Where is it now, when African journalists critical of France are routinely ignored, discredited, or disappeared? Let's get brutally honest. This isn't about freedom of speech, it's about controlling the narrative. And when that control is lost, they say the environment is toxic. What they mean is, they can no longer dominate the conversation. And when people no longer need foreign approval to trust their leader, the system breaks. Because in the Western model, Africa can have elections, but not inspiration. It can have governments, but not gods. It can have policies, but not poetry. Traore broke that formula. He became not just a president, but a pulse. And pulses scare empires. Because if one heartbeat grows too loud, it becomes a drum. And drums can call nations to rise. This isn't about image, it's about what the image awakens. And that's what they're trying to kill. Now, let's drop all the polite pretenses. The West isn't scared that Traore will become a dictator. They're scared that he might succeed without them. Because for the Western establishment, media, banks, diplomats, and think tanks, African failure is not a tragedy. It's a business model. It justifies foreign aid with interest. It justifies NGOs with jobs. It justifies peacekeepers with guns. It justifies control. And the moment an African leader proves you don't need any of it, the whole scam begins to unravel. That's why this media frenzy exists, not to stop tyranny, but to prevent proof. Proof that a young African can rise without Western schooling. Proof that sovereignty isn't theoretical. Proof that colonizers were never teachers. They were thieves. So they panic and they project. In the article, you'll notice a specific pattern. Phrases like, his rhetoric falls short. Tangible reforms are lacking. Civil liberties remain constrained. Insurgency continues. All of it is designed to preload his legacy with failure before it even begins. Because here's the hidden truth behind every Western critique. They are setting the stage in case he wins. Let's break it down. First, they delegitimize his popularity, calling it AI manipulation, digital myth-making, or algorithmic populism. Why? Because if he succeeds, they need the excuse ready. They need to say, it wasn't real. It was TikTok. They'll never allow themselves to admit that African youth chose Traore with clarity, not confusion. Second, they raise the bar impossibly high. No Western country would dare demand total security restoration and economic transformation within 2 years of civil chaos. But that's what they expect from Traore. Why? Because if he delivers even modest progress, it destroys decades of justification for foreign interference. You see, Traore is not being judged on performance. He's being judged on ideological disobedience. He didn't sign up for the usual game. He tore up the rules and said, let's play ours. And suddenly, everything is at risk. Because Burkina Faso proves that development can happen without IMF loans, without French troops, without Western consultants. Then what excuse will they have to stay in Mali? To dictate policy in Niger? To run surveillance in Senegal? It won't stop at Burkina Faso. It never does. Revolutions don't respect borders. This is what keeps them awake at night. Not coups d'etats, not fiery speeches, but the terrifying idea that African-led, African-funded, African-defended leadership might work. And if it works once, it will be copied. So, do you know now what this hate is all about? Will you let Traore become the new Gaddafi? Let us know in the comment section. Will you believe what is true? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.